We started really back with prescribed natural fire back in the early 1970s, and had no specific positions involved in our qualification system designated to deal with those fires. People who understood fire, understood the ecological role of fire, and had some fire background, dealt with the management of those positions. And then as that program evolved over time, up through the 1980s, and then of course with the Yellowstone fire season, 1988, caused us to relook at policy, do a policy revision. And that policy revision actually attempted to really come out and constrain prescribed natural fire program so that we wouldn't have large prescribed natural fires catch us by surprise late in the fire season. And it actually served to strengthen the program over time, made us more accountable for the long duration, made us do more long duration planning, look more at what the fires might do, where they might go. And it led to the development of several positions associated with long duration incidents. And then as we moved up through, we had, with that policy, we were designated to have two kinds of fire. All fires were either a wildfire or a prescribed fire. And within the prescribed fire component was prescribed natural fire. And again, there was still no position designated specifically for prescribed natural fire, but there was a prescribed fire manager position that was associated with a series of prescribed fires or planned ignitions that would oversee a number of prescribed fire burn bosses and help them coordinate these multiple fires. So we attempted to use that position to help coordinate the prescribed natural fire activities, and we realized that there was a lack of training for that position in dealing with long-term risk assessment and long-term planning for an uncontrolled fire that was going to remain uncontrolled from start to finish, which is what a prescribed natural fire actually was or is. So up through the mid-90s, there was an attempt to develop a new position called a prescribed natural fire manager. That was being worked on. A position task book had been prepared outlining the duties and the roles of that just at the time when the 1995 Federal Fire Policy Revision came out, which dramatically changed the policy direction, did away with the term prescribed natural fire, did away with the separation of wildfires and prescribed fires, and considered all fires, wildland fires, to be wildland fires. And then prescribed fires were only those management ignited fires under an approved plan. So what had been prescribed natural fire became a wildland fire. And in attempting to continue the activities that we use prescribed natural fire for and accomplishing resource benefits, we coined the term wildland fire use. And it became apparent that the prescribed natural fire manager position was not going to work for wildland fire use. The title was wrong. Some of the duties were wrong because they were associated with the prescribed fire side of things, or the previous side of things. So it was, after much discussion, it was decided that, well, a new command position was needed to oversee these wildland fire use events, which were the long duration wildland fires. And there's several avenues were possible for that. One was to add some additional training to our current, or to the wildfire side of the curriculum, that would add training on long-term risk assessment, management of long-duration fires, utilizing what was now the appropriate management response was the cornerstone of that 1995 policy, or in other words, looking at the full range of tactical response options available and choosing the right one for the appropriate situation, instead of just taking a suppression action or no suppression action, but mixing those up for the appropriate situation. And that option was not met with very much support because it involved adding additional training to existing positions. And many of the cooperators and partners in fire management did not want to add additional training. So other options were looked at of creating new positions again to deal with this command structure. When we added those new positions, some of those positions, the names didn't fit right with the terminology of the new policy. So we eventually settled on what was called a fire use manager. Would be the command position separate from our suppression qualifications, would be the command position for the wildland fire use events, would involve some specific training to give these individuals the background on how to do a long-term risk assessment, how to utilize that information in support of long-duration planning and implementation. And along with that, the new policy had given us, we had prepared what was called a Wildland Fire Use Implementation Procedures Reference Guide, which documented a new process for planning and implementing wildland fire use events, which was called a Wildland Fire Implementation Plan, a WFIP. So we had a previous course called National Park and Wilderness Fire Management, which was a course on dealing with prescribed natural fire in national parks and wildernesses. Now that the policy had changed and prescribed natural fire was no longer the proper term, that course evolved into a new course called Advanced Fire Use Applications, and it was given an S number to be in the suppression curriculum. It was called S580. And in order to have a number assigned to it, it had to be associated with meeting requirements to fill certain positions. And so this worked very well, where the course was given an S number, and it was a prerequisite then to become a fire use manager or the FUMA position. So that all worked very well, solidified the use of the fire use manager in managing wildland fire use events. And that course then taught how to prepare WFIPs, how to do long-term risk assessments, and how to then implement these long-duration activities. And that was a set of skills that was not taught anywhere else. That S580 course was unique. It was the only place, the single place where the WFIP process was taught. It was the single place where the application of a long-term risk assessment was taught and the evaluation of that. The actual performance of a long-term risk assessment was being taught in another course called RX 590, which was prescribed natural fire management and long-term fire behavior prediction, which eventually was combined with a fire behavior analyst course to do fire behavior projections over the long term and these long-term risk assessments. But those courses taught the actual the ability to complete a long-term risk assessment. This new course in the fire use manager would be associated with how to apply that into a planning document and then implement that over the long term, which again was taught nowhere else in any other part of the curriculum. So the fire use manager arose as a pretty important position. It became so important as the program grew in the late 1990s that it had to be typed into a type 1 and a type 2 to deal with different complexities of fires instead of having a single position, which is where we started. So it became a fire use manager type 1, a fire use manager type 2. And that carried on into the early 2000s, when in 2001 we began a review and update of the federal fire policy. And in 2003, that review and update came out, and the fire use manager was still solidified in that. Carried on, the Wildland Fire Use Implementation Procedures Reference Guide was revised in 2005 and implemented in 2006. Continued on, and then in 2009, another review and update of the federal fire policy occurred, where some operational clarification was the goal of this review, to simplify terms, provide greater clarification of the terms and the direction. And what happened then was that wildland fire use went away as a term, and all fires became wildland fires or prescribed fires through the terminology. So a fire that had previously been categorized as a wildland fire use event would now be a wildfire that was being managed for resource benefits versus a wildfire that was being suppressed for protection objectives. But they were all considered the same name as wildfires. So with the loss of the wildland fire use term and fire use in general, the fire use manager position then fell under this. That question was, is this position still needed or no longer needed? And it was determined that this is very important in where we are today, that the skill set that position possessed was still very important to long duration wildfire management and implementation, but the position itself by name was no longer needed to be consistent with the policy and terminology. So the strategic operations planner position arose from the demise, if you will, of the fire use manager to carry that skill set forward. And where we are now, the courses are changing to ensure that we still have the skill set taught, and the S580 course has emerged into another training course and being taught at regional and national levels to provide a greater audience that set of skills and information. And then the strategic operation planner position is still the single source of where the ability to interpret and use and apply long-term risk assessment information and look at the full range of tactical options is provided by a single individual or a trained individual to do that. Now, over time, the goal is to pass on that skill set and transfer that to a wide variety of positions on various units that deal with these kind of fires. A number of positions, whether they're FMOs, assistant FMOs, fuel specialists, some line officers, with incident management teams, with many of the staff on incident management teams, including incident commanders, planning section chiefs, operations section chiefs, analysts, and so on, so that many people will be able to look at this, provide this skill set, and bring this application to all kinds of wildfire management in the future. But we're in a transitional phase where we're headed that direction, and during this process, that strategic operation planner position is critically important to maintain this skill set and provide that capability.